Winter, 133 BC. Inside a hill town on the northern Meseta, somewhere above where the Duero and the Terra braid into one river, a man is boiling a strip of leather that used to be the rim of his shield. The fire is small, made of broken roof beams, and the boy sitting next to him has the kind of swollen belly Appian later describes without flinching. The boy is not crying. None of them are crying anymore. There is no breath left in the town for that. Outside, beyond the wooden palisades and the lines of stakes and the ditches and the 7 Roman camps spaced like teeth around the hills, a 46-year-old consul is sitting in his tent reading Xenophon. His name is Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus. 13 years earlier, he stood on the ash of Carthage. He has not given a single battle in 15 months. He is going to win this war by refusing to fight it. 8,000. That is the number that has to be said out loud at the start of this story, because for the next 90 minutes, everything turns on it. 8,000 adult Numantines, by the higher count in Appian, the lower estimates put it nearer 4, against a Roman army of 60,000 men, of whom only a fifth are legionaries. The rest are auxiliaries, allies, supply train slaves, surveyors, ditch diggers. The fight at Numantia is not Roman against Celtiberian. It is one engineer against one town. This is the story of how a man who had already razed Carthage was sent across the sea to scrape a single hill fort off the map, and chose to do it not with a sword, but with a shovel. Why Rome could no longer beat a town of 8,000 farmers in open battle. Why the Senate broke an existing treaty to send him. And why the way he won, slow, mathematical, without honor, destroyed something inside the Republic that no triumph would ever bring back. Appian, our main source for this campaign, and the only writer who gives us anything like a complete chronicle of it, opens his Iberian book with a warning that historians of Rome rarely repeat. He calls the Numantine War the most shameful war the Romans ever fought against any people, a Greek phrase that carries the weight a Greek would use for a private disgrace, not a public one. He does not mean for the Numantines, he means for Rome. I read that passage 3 times before I noticed what it isn't saying. Appian, writing in Alexandria almost 300 years after the siege, isn't moralizing. He is reporting a judgment that the Romans themselves seem to have shared by the time he was writing, that the way they won at Numantia was not the way Rome was supposed to win. The town itself sat on a steep hill above a river bend in what is today the province of Soria in north-central Spain. The Romans had been trying to take it, on and off, for more than 2 decades. The Celtiberians of the Aravaci tribe, of whom the Numantines were the largest community, were not a desert people or a mountain people in the way the chroniclers sometimes flatten them. They farmed wheat and barley on the plateaus. They worked iron. They drank a Celtic beer Polybius mentions in passing, and their weapons, the falcata, the curved Iberian slashing sword, alongside straight short swords of the kind from which the gladius hispaniensis seems to take its name, were the equal of anything coming out of Italy at the time. They were not a marginal enemy. They were the reason Rome could not finish Spain. By the year Scipio arrived, 5 consuls in succession had failed at Numantia. Quintus Pompeius, in 141, defeated and forced into a treaty he then denied making. Marcus Popilius Lanus, in 139, repulsed under the walls. Gaius Hostilius Mancinus, in 137, surrounded with 20,000 men in the open grounds south of the town. his army saved only by a treaty he signed at sword point, a treaty the Senate would later refuse to ratify and use as cover for handing Mancinus naked and in chains to the Numantines, who refused to accept him and sent him back. Lepidus, in 136, who attacked the wrong town on his own initiative and was recalled. Quintus Calpurnius Piso, in 135, who chose simply not to march. 5 commanders, 4 defeats, 1 refusal, and a town that should not have been able to hold off a single legion was, by the autumn of 135, the open wound of the late Republic. It is into this wound that Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus is sent, the same man who, 10 years earlier, had stood on the rubble of Carthage and wept at the line from Homer about Troy. Polybius, who was there, records that Scipio quoted the line and turned to him with the thought that someday a similar fate might overtake Rome itself, a passage preserved for us at second hand through later writers who quoted the lost Polybian original. The man who said that sentence is the man Rome chose to crush Numantia. Polybius, by the way, will be at Numantia too. He will leave us a fragment of his own first-hand description of the siege, Book 35 of his histories, of which we have only scraps. When I read those scraps, I keep thinking that Polybius does not understand what he is watching either. He calls Scipio's method, in a Greek phrase that resists English, a new manner of warfare. By his Greek standards, what Scipio did at Numantia was not warfare at all. Scipio arrived at the Roman base in northern Spain in the spring of 134 BC. The army he found there was, by his own reports back to Rome, no longer an army. The camp was full of women. By one ancient account, as many as 2,000 prostitutes were registered with the quartermasters, and full of merchants, fortune-tellers, and soothsayers. Soldiers were sleeping on imported couches with silk coverings. A common legionary, when ordered to march, was hiring a slave to carry his shield. Some of the centurions were taking bribes to let men sleep through guard duty. Whatever the Numantines were, they were beating an army that did not exist anymore. Scipio's first act was not military. It was a purge. By a single edict, he expelled every camp follower, every merchant who could not prove a contract, every fortune-teller, every silver couch. Soldiers were ordered to leave behind everything except a brass cooking pot, an iron spit, 1 cup, a sword, and a pilum. Bread was rationed. Meat was reduced to what a man could carry roasted in his pack. He banned beds. Men slept on straw or on the ground in their cloaks. Then he marched the army, not on Numantia, but in a wide circle around the central plateau, through the lands of allied Celtiberian tribes, day after day, building and tearing down a full marching camp each evening, until the men learned again what the basic discipline of a Roman field force was supposed to look like. By the time he turned the column toward Numantia in the early autumn of 134, the army that arrived under the hill was a different organism from the one he had found. What Scipio brought with him as well, alongside this retrained army, was a personal staff that tells you something about how Rome already knew this campaign would not be a normal one. Polybius, the historian, as I said, was there. Gaius Marius, the future 7 times consul, who would later destroy the Cimbri, was a young military tribune in Scipio's camp. Whatever Marius was watching, he was watching closely. Jugurtha of Numidia, sent by his grandfather's heir Micipsa as part of a Numidian cavalry contingent, was there. The same Jugurtha who 20 years later will buy and bleed Rome from inside Africa. A young Tiberius Gracchus was not there for this campaign, but he had been there 4 years earlier as a quaestor under Mancinus, and it was Tiberius Gracchus, in his mid-20s, who had personally negotiated the treaty that saved 20,000 Roman soldiers, the treaty the Senate then broke. Remember that. The Senate broke the treaty Tiberius Gracchus had signed with his own honor. Within 4 years of the fall of Numantia, Tiberius Gracchus would be dead in the streets of Rome, killed with a fragment of a bench by a senatorial mob. The first political murder of the late Republic begins, in a way that none of the ancient sources quite spell out, in the dust of this Spanish town. To understand what happens in the past, to understand what the 8,000 of Numantia were dying for, and what Scipio's 9 kilometers of wall destroyed in Rome itself, you have to walk back into the world before he arrived. Numantia, in the autumn of 135 BC, the year before Scipio set foot in Spain, looked nothing like the iconography of doom that later Romans would put on it. It was a working hill town. A grid of stone and timber houses runs along the spine of the ridge, rectangular, with thatched roofs sealed in mud against the winter wind that comes off the Sistema Iberico. There are kilns for pottery in 2 clusters at the southern end. There is a forge, not one, but at least 3, by the slag heaps that were dug up in the early 20th century, 3 working iron forges turning out the falcata blades the Romans had been trying to copy for 40 years. The streets are narrow, paved with riverstone, with traces of a gutter and drainage system in the excavated levels. The Aravacci of Numantia, in the year their world starts to end, were not the bearded, howling barbarians of the engravings. They were a literate, municipal community of perhaps 8,000 adults. By Appian's high account, the lower estimate, attributed in the surviving manuscripts to a separate tradition, puts it nearer 4,000. The manuscripts disagree on the number, and I think the lower one may actually be closer to the truth of who was inside the wall when the wall went up. But it is the higher number, 8,000, that Appian himself prefers, and it is the higher number Rome had to break. They had been at peace, in a thin and provisional sense, since the spring of 136. The treaty Tiberius Gracchus had negotiated under Mancinus in 137 was still nominally in force, in the way that frozen things are nominally in place, no longer pursued, not yet broken. The Numantine Senate, and the chroniclers do call it a senate, a council of elders, was waiting. They had sent embassies twice that summer to Rome, asking the Roman Senate to formally ratify Tiberius's treaty. The embassies were treated coolly and sent home with no answer. Inside the Roman Senate, the question was not whether to ratify, but how to destroy. There was a faction, the populares around Tiberius Gracchus himself, who argued that to break the treaty was a religious abomination, a violation of fides, and that Rome's word, once given by a Roman magistrate in the field, was Roman law. There was the senatorial faction, the Optimates, who argued that a treaty signed under compulsion to save a defeated army was no treaty at all, and that to ratify Mancinus's terms would be to admit publicly that Rome had been beaten by a town of farmers. There was the practical faction, the family connections of Scipio Aemilianus, the Aemilii and the Cornelii, who argued for a more ingenious solution. Do not ratify, do not break, do not act. Hand the man who signed the treaty, bound and naked, to the Numantines themselves. Let them decide what to do with him. If they accepted Mancinus, Rome was free of the treaty obligation. If they refused him, they would refuse him, the senators calculated, because the Numantines wanted territory and a treaty, not a hostage, then the treaty was void by their own gesture, not Rome's. This is what they did. Hostilius Mancinus, who had saved 20,000 Roman lives by signing in the field, was stripped of his consular toga, bound with leather thongs, and delivered by his own quaestor to the gate of Numantia. The quaestor was the same Tiberius Gracchus who had negotiated the original treaty. He had to deliver in chains the man whose word he had personally guaranteed. The Numantines opened the gate, looked at Mancinus standing naked in the autumn cold, and refused to accept him. They sent him back. They were not stupid. They understood what Rome was trying to do. The treaty, by Roman legal reasoning, was now void. The campaign that began the following spring with Scipio's appointment began in this single act of bad faith. And it was the gesture, more than any battle, that broke something in the next generation of Romans. Tiberius Gracchus walked back from the gate of Numantia a different man. Within 5 years, he was dead in his own city. In Rome, meanwhile, the question of Numantia had collided with another question that the Republic did not know how to ask. Italy was running out of small farmers. The wars of the 2nd century, Hannibal, Macedonia, Carthage, Greece, now Spain, had consumed 2 generations of the peasantry. The legions were filled, increasingly, with the dispossessed, with men who had lost their farms to the great senatorial estates while they were serving on Roman frontiers. When Tiberius Gracchus stood up in 133 BC, the very year Scipio's wall was closing around Numantia, and proposed his land law, the Lex Sempronia Agraria, the redistribution of public land to landless veterans, he was reacting to what he had seen in Spain. The Numantines were a community of small farmers who still owned their fields. The Romans surrounding them were no longer that. Tiberius Gracchus tried to legislate Numantia, in the Roman sense, back into existence. The senators who killed him understood that better than he did. Polybius does not connect these dots in the fragments we have, but Polybius was thinking about them. In Book 6 of his Histories, written by his own dating before he came to Numantia, he had laid out the famous cycle of constitutions, the anacyclosis, by which states pass from monarchy through tyranny, aristocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and ochlocracy back to monarchy. He thought Rome had escaped the cycle by mixing the 3 forms. When he stood by Scipio's side at Numantia and watched a Roman general winning a war by refusing to fight one, I wonder what version of anacyclosis he was checking it against. Modern scholars are split on this. Frank Wallbank, the great 20th century editor of Polybius, argued that Polybius's surviving comments on Numantia are basically admiring, a tactical analyst's admiration of an elegant solution. The Spanish scholar Adolf Schulten, who excavated the site between 1905 and 1912 and gave us most of what we know about its physical layout, thought Polybius was disturbed by what he saw. I lean towards Schulten on this, for reasons I'll get to in the next part, when we look at his maps and what may be wrong with them, but the Wallbank reading is real, and a fair-minded viewer of this story should know it exists. Scipio himself was not, in any normal Roman reading, the natural choice for this command. He had already held the consulship once, in 147 BC. The Lex Vilia Annalis, the law that governed the order and timing of magistracies, explicitly forbade a second consulship, and especially a second consulship for command of a war that did not, by the standards of Roman tradition, rise to the dignity of a Hannibalic crisis. Numantia was an embarrassment, not a war for the existence of the state. To wave the Lex Villia aside for a hill town of 8,000 farmers was, in the language of the older senators, an institutional surrender. But the institutional surrender was the point. Rome could not afford another defeat at Numantia. The Senate suspended the Lex Villia, elected Scipio in absentia, and gave him a free hand. They also, for the first time in a major imperial campaign, refused him a state-funded levy. He could take only volunteers. The implication was clear. If Scipio failed, the responsibility would be his alone, not the Senate's. This was a campaign Rome wanted to win and wanted, simultaneously, to disavow. Scipio raised 4,000 volunteers, many of them clients of his own family and of the Aemilii, including a personal cohort of 500 bodyguards he called the Cohors Amicorum, the cohort of friends, the precursor of the imperial Praetorian. He sailed from Italy at the end of winter, landed at Tarraco on the Mediterranean coast, picked up the existing Roman field army at the camp of Quintus Calpurnius Piso, the consul who had refused to march, and began the long march inland through the high tableland toward the Duero Valley. He did not march on Numantia. He marched, for the first part of the summer, in a circle, northwest toward the lands of the Vacaei tribe, who had been supplying Numantia with grain, east along the Ebro Valley, south across the Meseta. He burned harvests, he emptied granaries, he sold whole villages into slavery. Appian admits the figure of 20,000 Vacaei taken in this single sweep, though Velleius Paterculus, who otherwise repeats the campaign's basic outlines, omits the number entirely. Scipio's logic was simple, and the chronicles, even the hostile ones, do not quite know how to argue with it. A siege of Numantia would last as long as the Numantines could eat. If the Vacaei and the surrounding tribes were burned to ash before the siege began, the Numantines would eat through their own stores and then starve in their own walls. He was not yet fighting them. He was fighting their breadbasket. And the army of 60,000 men, Romans, allied Iberians, Numidian cavalry under Jugurtha, Greek engineers, slave logistics, that he was personally leading through the late summer heat of central Iberia was not, in Polybius's word, an army anymore. It was a tool. By the early autumn of 134 BC, the surrounding country was scorched in a wide ring around the Duero Valley. Scipio turned the column finally toward Numantia itself, and as it came over the last set of low ridges and the town came into view on its hill above the river junction, the engineers were already laying out, with measuring rods, the line of what would become the most famous engineering work of the late Republic, and the first time in Roman warfare that a circumvallation was used not as a holding measure, but as the entire campaign. The ditches and palisades and stake lines that would close around the 8,000 of Numantia were not yet in the ground, but the survey was already done. The geometry of what was about to happen was already drawn on wax tablets in Greek and Latin in the consul's tent. From the wall on the hill, the Numantines could see the surveyors at work and could read what the geometry meant. By Polybius's account, preserved through Diodorus, they sent one last embassy to Scipio's tent and asked, this time, not for a treaty, but only for terms. He sent the embassy back with a single Latin word, deditio, unconditional surrender. The Numantines went back to their hill and closed the gate, and in the camps below, the legionaries picked up the shovels. From inside Numantia, the shovels were not a sound, but a feeling. The ground vibrated. 40,000 men digging in shifts, day and night, in a wide circle around the hill. By Appian's count, 9 kilometers of trench, double, with 7 permanent camps, a stone and timber wall between the trenches, palisaded ramparts, and a line of stakes leaning outward against any charge. There are scholars who will tell you 9 kilometers is too neat a number, that Appian rounded. Maybe. The German archaeologist Adolf Schulten, who excavated the site between 1905 and 1912 and mapped the camp ruins at Castillejo, Peña Redonda, Travesadas, Valdivaron, De Hisila, Saladilla, and Molino, 7, just as Appian says, measured a perimeter of about 9 kilometers on the ground. That is an extraordinary alignment between a Greek narrative and an archaeological survey 2,000 years apart, and the very neatness of it is now suspect. I have to stop here for a moment, because the most important modern dispute about Numantia is whether Schulten saw what he saw or whether he found what he was looking for. Fernando Quesada Sanz and a group of Spanish military archaeologists working in the years since have resurveyed several of Schulten's campsites with modern techniques and concluded that the German excavators' published plans were more geometric than the soil itself supports. Walls that were ambiguous in the ground were drawn straight on his maps. Post holes that did not exist where Roman manuals said they should appear were quietly tidied. The 7 camps are real. The 9-kilometer perimeter is probably real. But the elegant geometric grid that Schulten reconstructed inside each camp, the textbook Roman castra of the Polybian manual, has been partly retouched. The camps that ringed the hill were almost certainly less neat than the maps Schulten left us, and the wall connecting them was probably built in segments where the terrain allowed, not as a continuous masonry line. I lean toward Quesada Sanz here. The wall was extraordinary. The wall as Schulten drew it was extraordinary in a way that flattered Rome more than the wall on the ground actually did. But none of that mattered to the 8,000 on the hill. What mattered was that the wall closed. By December of 134 BC, the circle was complete. 2 ditches, each at least 3 meters deep, with the spoil thrown up between them into a wall topped with wooden palisades. Stakes leaning outward at the angle of a man's chest, sharpened. Between the 2 rivers, the Duero and the Terra, Scipio built additional booms with timbers chained across the water and floating logs studded with blades. Velleius Paterculus mentions the river booms only in passing. Appian describes them in detail. Whether they actually had blades or only the spear points the chronicle says, the manuscripts disagree. What is certain is that a Numantine on a raft could no longer drift downstream out of the valley. The town was sealed off from grain, sealed off from contact with the surrounding tribes, sealed off from the rivers that fed it. And in the camps, the legionaries waited. The first 3 months of winter passed quietly. Scipio refused all skirmishes. When a Numantine sortie came out to provoke the legionaries, the men were ordered to fall back into the trench and not engage. The order was absolute. A centurion who broke it would be flogged. There was a moment, recorded by Appian and repeated by Plutarch in a different form, when a group of young Numantines came up to the trench in the early dawn, shouting insults, the standard provocations a besieged force throws at besiegers to draw a reckless charge. The legionaries on the wall watched in silence and did not respond. There was nothing to respond to. The arithmetic was working without them. Inside the town, by the end of January, the grain was running out. Numantine households of perhaps 8 or 10 people were down to a daily ration that Appian gives as a single barley loaf and a strip of dried meat. By February, there was no meat. By early spring, there was no bread. They began boiling the leather of their shields. The shield strips Appian describes, not as a literary image, but as a domestic procedure, were softened by boiling for a full day, then chewed slowly because the jaw could not work them with force. A similar procedure appears in the surviving Polybian fragments, where he reaches for a Greek word that literally means raw flesh eating, but that here may simply mean eating something that is not food. Polybius is reaching, in his Greek, for a word that does not exist for what these people are doing. There is a passage in Appian, Iberica, sections 96 and 97, that I will paraphrase rather than quote, because the literal Greek is colder than English can carry. He says that in the last weeks, when the leather was gone, some of the Numantines ate their dead. He does not say all of them did. He does not even say most of them did. He says it happened. He does not stage it. He reports it. Some modern Spanish historians have argued that this passage may be a later, moralizing insertion borrowed from the literary topos of besieged city cannibalism, of which the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD is the most famous case. The argument is reasonable, but the older reading, that Appian had access to an Iberian source, possibly through Posidonius, that recorded the act as fact, is also reasonable, and I incline toward it because Appian elsewhere is careful to flag literary inheritance, and here he does not. It was in this winter, somewhere between February and April of 133 BC, that one Numantine named Retigenes carried out an act that Appian gives several paragraphs to, and that I think is the structural heart of this entire story. Retigenes, the Greek transliteration of an Aravatian name we do not know the original of, gathered 5 companions and a portable bridge made of leather and reeds. On a moonless night, the 6 of them carried the bridge to the inside of the western wall of the town, threw it across the first Roman ditch, climbed the palisade between the ditches, threw the bridge across the second ditch, and dropped into the open country between Scipio's circumvallation and the next tribal settlement to the south. They rode through the night to the town of Lutia, somewhere south of Numantia, the modern identification debated between Cantalucia and Luzaga, perhaps 40 Roman miles away, to ask the young men of Lutia to come and break the wall. The young men of Lutia were prepared to come. The elders of Lutia, hearing what was about to happen, sent a runner to Scipio's camp. Scipio's response was, in the cold language of Appian, instant. He marched 7,000 men south to Lutia in a single forced march of 1 night and 1 day, surrounded the town at dawn, and demanded that the 400 young men who had agreed to march on Numantia be handed to him. The town handed them over. Scipio cut off their hands, all 400, and sent the mutilated boys back to their fathers as a sign of what would happen to any community that interfered with the siege of Numantia. The chronicle does not say what Retigenes did when he heard. The chronicle does not say whether he rode back to Numantia or whether he stayed in the hills and disappeared into Celtiberia and the later record. Appian moves on. But you have to stop here, where Appian doesn't, and notice what has happened. Scipio Aemilianus has just mutilated 400 young men of a town that was not at war with Rome, that had not yet committed any act, only intended one. He did it to make the geometry of the wall around Numantia work. The wall around Numantia, when you remove the engineering vocabulary, was a wall around the mercy of every community that might have helped. By Polybius's standard of warfare, and Polybius was standing in the camp when this order was given, this was, as he himself puts it, a new manner of warfare. He could not name it. If the period interests you, the chronicles, the maps, the small decisions that lost provinces and changed republics, this is the work the channel does. There is more of it waiting. Back to the wall before dawn. Some weeks after Retigenes' breakout, in the late spring of 133 BC, the Numantine Senate sent 5 emissaries down to Scipio's tent. Their leader was Avarice, whom Appian names as a man of dignity and clear voice. They came to ask, finally, what terms Scipio would give. Avarice offered, on behalf of his people, to surrender on conditions: that the city walls be left standing, that the Numantines be permitted to leave with their household possessions, that the children not be sold. Scipio listened in silence. He gave the same one-word answer he had given the year before: deditio, unconditional. Avarice asked whether the Numantines might at least retain their own weapons for the surrender, so that they would not enter the Roman camp empty-handed and humiliated. Scipio said no. The embassy returned to the town. By Appian's account, when Avarice reported the terms, the Numantine Senate killed him and his 5 companions on the spot, accusing them of having struck a private deal with Scipio. They did not believe deditio could be Scipio's actual answer. They could not imagine a Roman commander whose only condition was that there be no conditions. The killing of Avarice is, in Appian, the moment when the inside of the town breaks before the outside does. The end came in August. The exact date is disputed. The later Latin chroniclers place the fall in late summer. Appian gives no calendar at all. What the chronicles agree on is the manner. The surviving Numantines came out through the eastern gate. By Appian's count, perhaps 1,500 of them out of the original 8,000. The rest dead in the town from starvation, or by their own hand, or, in the older sources, by mass killing of the families by their own warriors before the gate was opened. Appian and Florus both describe Numantines killing their wives and children rather than let them be enslaved. Florus, writing in the 2nd century, lays the scene out as a kind of stoic tableau. Appian, closer to the original Iberian source, lays it out as a single, appalling fact. The 1,500 who came out walked between 2 lines of legionaries in silence. Scipio selected 50 of them, by his own choice, to be sent to Rome and walk in his triumph. The rest he sold to the slave dealers who had been camped in the train of the army for the last 6 months. The town was razed to the ground. Polybius writes that he watched Scipio for a long moment, standing on the wall as the fires went up across the houses and the kilns and the forges, and that Scipio said nothing. The line about Carthage, about the strange foreboding, does not appear here in the surviving fragments. It may have. We do not have the page. The skull cup of this story is not a skull. The artifact, the thing the camera comes back to, is the boiled shield leather. 3 references in Appian, 1 in Polybius, 1 in the late Florus. A strip of cowhide from the rim of an Iberian catra, boiled for a day, chewed slowly through a swollen jaw. It is on this strip of leather that the late Republic turns. Numantia did not fall to a sword. It fell to a wall that wore the town's stomach down to the rim of its own equipment. And that, not Carthage, not Corinth, is what the Romans themselves seem to have understood Numantia to be, when Appian, 3 centuries later, still reaches for the strongest Greek word for shame to name it. Scipio took the cognomen Numantinus. He returned to Rome to a triumph in late 133. He was now Scipio Africanus Numantinus, the only Roman in history to take both names. Within 4 years, his cousin and political opponent Tiberius Gracchus would be murdered in the Forum during the assembly that was supposed to extend Tiberius's land redistribution law for a second term. The senatorial mob that killed Tiberius was led by Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica Serapio, a relative on Scipio Aemilianus's mother's side, and Tiberius's skull, by the ancient sources, was broken with a fragment of a wooden bench in the assembly hall. When the news of Tiberius's murder reached Scipio Aemilianus, he is reported by Plutarch, Lives, Tiberius Gracchus, 21, to have quoted a line from Homer's Odyssey. "Even so, may he perish, who does such things." Plutarch himself is careful with the report. He gives it as something said to have been said, and the line, in Homer, is spoken of the suitors. Scholars argue about whether Scipio meant Tiberius or Tiberius's killers. The ambiguity may be Plutarch's own. The fact that Scipio Aemilianus's own death in the spring of 129 came suddenly in his bed at night under circumstances no source dares to specify, some saying poison, some saying natural, closes the circle in a way no Greek chorus would be allowed to close it. Numantia's long shadow falls across the next 2 centuries of Rome. Within 50 years of the fall, the republic that Scipio